Today is Remembrance Sunday, and people from across the UK and the Commonwealth came together this morning to hold a 2-minute silence to honour those who made the ultimate sacrifice. Royal Marine buglers sounded the last post at the cenotaph, and wreaths were laid by members of the royal family, political party leaders, former prime ministers, military figures and representatives from Commonwealth nations. His Majesty King Charles III led the commemorations at the cenotaph in what was his first Remembrance Sunday since the death of his mother, Queen Elizabeth II. I am now joined by historian Dr. David Starkey and retired British Army officer and military historian Lieutenant General Jonathon Riley. Thank you both for joining me today. Dr. Starkey, I'll start with you if you don't mind. Could you start off by telling us a little bit about the history of Remembrance Sunday and why it still holds so much significance in the UK and abroad?
Well, listen, Calvin, to what you just heard. Those 11 strikes of Big Ben. They commemorate the moment, the literal moment, of the end of the First World War, which ended on I remembered as a child, on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month of 1918. And remember, it's a war the Secretary of State for Defence, Ben Wallace, produced a terrible underestimate. He said tens of thousands dead. In the First World War, it's 1 million dead. It is unspeakable horror that hit every town, village, community in the country. What's extraordinary is that the real nature of Remembrance Sunday, we now see it as grand, official, royal. It begins as popular. It begins because the people wanted it, because none of those 1 million bodies were brought home. They lay where they fell in the wonderful war ceremonies, cemeteries that were built afterwards. So there was this terrible sense of emptiness. People hadn't been able to mourn. They wanted somewhere where they could mourn. And what happened in 1919, to celebrate the peace, there was a monument erected. It was temporary. It was a wooden and plaster structure by the great architect, Sir Edwin Lutyens, and it took this name. Remember, I said no bodies came back. It took the Greek name cenotaph, which means an empty tomb. And it was originally put there for a grand ceremony, actually of celebration. In July, immediately after the dreadful peace treaties at Versailles and the Trianon, which tore apart German Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the end of the Russian Empire, and so on. But what happened was, as the monument sat there through the summer and the autumn, people gathered. And on the 11th of November, 1919, the crowds turned up. And they came with wreaths, and they cried, and they mourned. And it became official then. As it were, it's rather like Princess Diana. The people led. There was something you will understand, Calvin. This is a sort of sainthood. It's a holy place. People come to lay things. And then the whole thing is made official. The grand panjandarum of ceremony at the time, the Foreign Secretary, the wonderful Marquis Curzon, Lord Curzon, takes the thing over. Lutyens turns it into the magnificent permanent structure we see there. And from 1920 onwards, the ceremony becomes formalized. And then in 1921, we add the poppy, and the whole thing rolls forward. But we don't get to, I'll shut up a second, we don't get to Remembrance Sunday, actually, until the Second World War. This is something very striking. In the Second World War, productivity was thought so important that we stopped celebrating on the 11th because it's a weekday, and we shift it to a Sunday.
And I love that it started organically. We laid a wreath at church this morning, obviously, and I love that that started from the people before it became an official ceremony. Lieutenant General Riley, the late Queen considered Remembrance Sunday one of the most important days in the royal calendar. Why do you think that was?
Well, she herself, of course, had served in uniform in the Second World War, and father had served in the First World War. And other members of the family as well. Her father's brother had been killed in an air crash, and she had first-hand knowledge of it. She was also, of course, closely involved with the armed forces. She was colonel-in-chief of some regiments including my own, and maintained a close connection with the military. And so she was very aware of the continuing losses in conflict in modern times. And until the end of the campaign in Afghanistan, there'd only been 1 year since, I think, 1886, when a British soldier was not killed on operations somewhere in the world. And that was 1968. And so I think for the Queen, as for many of us who were born after the wars, Remembrance Sunday is just as much about sacrifice on behalf of freedom in modern times as it was back then, as David rightly pointed out.
Absolutely. And Professor Starkey, this is obviously King Charles III's first Remembrance Sunday since the death of his mother. Did this morning's ceremony differ in any way to when the late Queen did it?
Only very slightly. And I must say, I found, dare I say it, a little incongruous that we commemorate her by her racing colours. I know she loved racing, but it's an odd way of doing it. But again, it's the problem. How do you, in a sense, with royal ceremony, which is so fixed, how do you differentiate? Clearly, that colour of the ribbon is one way of doing it. But can I just add one thing to why it's so central to the monarchy?
Of course.
Remember, First World War was actually fought in the name of the king and country. I have a plaque downstairs which commemorates my uncle Abraham, of course I never knew, who died at Gallipoli as a very young man with his engagement letter and photograph folded in his pocket. And to every soldier who fell, there was given this extraordinary, rather beautiful, very much in the same manner as Lutyens, this bronze plaque with a great lion and a mourning Britannia on it, with for king and country. And so the monarchy, is the symbol. Remember, and fear that our general may bristle a little bit, there isn't such a thing as a British nation. There is a crown, there is a United Kingdom, and the monarchy lies at the heart as the only genuine universal symbol. And the Queen was passionately, profoundly aware of that, as of course is King Charles. So it's this desire for the monarchy as symbol. Remember, in the Second World War, just to vary it a little, George VI was not a little jealous of Churchill when he starts to appear as the national symbol. And you remember there's a wonderful moment of competition at D-Day when Churchill, in very Boris Johnson mode, said, I'm going to go. And the king stops him very simply by saying, Mr. Churchill, your name is not yet Sir Winston, if you go, I go, which stopped it. So it's this role of the monarchy as the ultimate symbol. And but again, it has to be a popular symbol, because what's also very striking, and we'll be talking, Calvin, I think, a lot about these things, what the First World War saw was the complete rejigging of the monarchy as that strange paradox, that ultimate British paradox, a democratic monarchy. In 1917, at the height of the First World War, when, remember, there's real fear of Red Revolution, you completely invented that other central act to which the Queen was so committed, the investiture. You invent the Order of the British Empire to honour those who have served in the war, those who served in the vastly expanded bureaucracy, and the first investiture, again, this sense of the populism of the thing. The first investiture of the Order of the British Empire doesn't take place in Buckingham Palace. It doesn't take place in a grand ballroom. It takes place in Ibrox Park Football Stadium in Glasgow. And so, you have a monarchy which is consciously adjusting to democracy, to the arrival of in the years that we're commemorating, remember, between 1919 and 1922. This is when the Lloyd George coalition falls. With that, there is the death of the Liberal Party and there is the rise of the Labour Party. And so many of those soldiers would be the voters for the Labour Party. And the monarchy is profoundly, deeply aware of that fact.
I think we should also be aware of how much has changed since then. I can't imagine a Prime Minister fighting for king and country this day and age. That's remarkable that was acceptable and a given. Lieutenant General Riley, as a former soldier yourself, what does Remembrance Sunday mean to you? And can you encapsulate maybe some of the some of the conflicts that we remember on Remembrance Sunday?
Yeah, I mean, as a small boy, of course, it was for me all about the First and Second World Wars, and I can remember turning up at the cenotaph as a boy, and my father's and my grandfather's generations were all there, and they'd all seen war service, and a lot of them had an absolutely wonderful time and wished it was still going on. But at the same time, it was a moment of sadness to reflect on the sacrifice that their friends and brothers had made, and everybody wore a poppy because the war or the wars was very much in people's minds, and they were very much aware that the poppy symbolised the debt of gratitude for our freedom, for our liberties that had been bought so dearly by so many people. And the further away we get, the danger is that the less that resonates. Of course, since I joined the military myself, I've lost friends and subordinates in campaigns, starting with, in my case, Northern Ireland. And I think we've forgotten in recent years, or perhaps deliberately so, just how difficult and dangerous Northern Ireland was. An awful lot of civilians died. But in 1972, we lost more members of the security forces, police and military, than in the campaigns in the Balkans, Sierra Leone, Iraq and Afghanistan put together. And those people were often in our thoughts and minds, soldiers in my own battalion who'd been killed. And then, of course, after the end of the Cold War, I was on operations in the Balkans, in Sierra Leone, and more latterly in Iraq and Afghanistan, where the immediacy of the broadcast media, as in America with the Vietnam War, brought those casualties right into people's homes immediately. And when I was out there in command, I tried to go to every repatriation ceremony, and it was always a deeply touching moment. And we were all just hoping that our comrades were not being killed for nothing, that we would be able to leave Afghanistan a better place than we found it. And one of the striking things I remember was how deeply affected the bearer parties always were when the last thing they could do for their mate was carry his coffin onto the aircraft, and they were always absolutely distraught after that was over. And you could see that hope and fear written in their faces.
That's really heartwarming. That's quite touching. My father also served in Northern Ireland. He was at church this morning. I couldn't be more proud. But I also understand that your regiment was involved in the creation of the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier.
Not directly. King George V was Colonel-in-Chief of the regiment, and had been so since he was Prince of Wales in 1901, and was very close to the regiment because, of course, until 1915 there were no Welsh Guards. And the medal room in Carnarvon Castle is our memorial to him and King George VI. And there we have his uniforms and the First World War colours, and a large number of medals. But we also have the ironwork from the coffin of the unknown soldier. There were two coffins made. There was a trial run and then the real one. And the ironwork was made at the Brunswick Iron Foundry in Carnarvon. And the trial run was then lodged with us. And so if you're in North Wales on holiday, pop in and have a look, and you'll see it. You'll see it there as a piece of living history.
Professor Starkey, where else is Remembrance Sunday celebrated? Because it's not just in Great Britain, is it?
No, it is, of course, profoundly important in the whole Commonwealth. Remember, we won both wars, not because we fought alone. There is this great myth, England stood alone. It didn't. It had an empire. And if you actually go, we've talked now about remembrance in England. Go to Ypres in Belgium. Go and look at the Menin Gate in Ypres. It's one of the greatest, the noblest, the most moving structures. And you look, it's simply this vast arch with inscribed on it the name of every soldier who died in the area. And there are tens and tens of thousands. They are Indian. They are West Indies. They are Canadian. They are Australian. They are New Zealand. And remember, for so many of those men, they were very recent immigrants from Britain. My uncles, my great uncles on my mother's side, they just left Oldham to go to work in Ontario, in Canada. It's a very, very similar town that was emerging in cotton, and they join up. And you know what? It's the strangest things. These were Oldham boys. They found themselves recruited. They both survived happily. They found themselves recruited into the Canadian Highlands. So I have the photographs of these lads, fresh from the Oldham mill, looking a bit plumper because they've been better fed in Canada, wearing full Highland dress. But in the Commonwealth, remember, it is remembrance too. And we talk again, we were talking about the poppy. The poppy doesn't come from Britain. The poppy begins in America, and it's more fully developed in Canada. And when I was appearing last week with Mark Stein, Mark was complaining bitterly because there we are, because the Canadian poppy is much nicer than the tiresome Brit poppy, which is this awful paper thing. and again, what's also striking, both of you, is the poppy begins not as an official thing. I'm
afraid I've run out of time, Professor Starkey, but
it begins as a popular movement. It's tough.
I honestly could listen to this history story all day. It's very fascinating and very relevant. So thank you both very, very much. That was retired British Army officer and military historian Lieutenant General Jonathon Riley and Professor Dr. David Starkey. Thanks for your time.